Let me begin by thanking the board and management of Wemabod for the very kind invitation extended to me to give this keynote address. In a few short years, Wemabod has become one of West Africa's largest real estate companies in deed and in fact. I'm especially grateful to my dear brother and friend, Otunba Bimbo Ashiru, the chair of the board of BODIJA Investments. He had conveyed, as he said, this invitation to me possibly over 6 months ago. But those who know him will agree that not only is he extremely meticulous, but he will also not take no for an answer. So he has reminded me almost every month, sometimes twice a month, since then, that I had to be here today. So I've actually been in Lagos. I've been in Abuja most of the time. I've actually been in Lagos now for 2 days, just so that I would not, for any reason at all, not be here at 9 o'clock of the 3rd of February. I believe that we can all agree that the BODIJA Investment Company and its subsidiary, Wemabod, are unlike most business entities anywhere in the world. And this is so by virtue of their history and the circumstances of their founding under the visionary leadership of what is widely regarded as perhaps the most progressive government in Nigeria's history, the government of the former Western region, Nigeria. They were conceived. They were conceived with a responsibility that extends beyond commerce. They were shaped to be agents of socio-economic transformation. And this heritage, in my view, imposes both a moral and a developmental obligation to create value, not merely for the privileged few, but for the wider region and indeed the nation as a whole, in diverse and enduring ways. For Wemabod, therefore, real estate cannot be viewed solely from the lens of profit. Housing is not simply a commodity for those who can afford it. It is a powerful instrument of socio-economic transformation with implications for equity, for collective prosperity, and also for the dignity of individuals. So it is this deep sense of social responsibility that, in my view, underpins the theme of the topic that I've been invited to address today, unlocking land and infrastructure for inclusive housing, a regional agenda. But I have chosen to slightly reframe the title for reasons that will become clearer as I proceed. So the title now reads, From BODIJA to the Future, Unlocking Land and Infrastructure for Inclusive Housing, a Regional Agenda. From BODIJA to the Future, Unlocking Land and Infrastructure for Inclusive Housing, a Regional Agenda. Across the southwest of Nigeria, from Lagos to Ibadan, from Abeokuta to Akure, our cities are growing at extraordinary speed. And this growth is not accidental. It reflects population dynamics, economic concentration, and increasing regional integration. The real challenge before us has never been urbanization itself, but how urbanization is being managed. Too often, growth is disorderly, is exclusionary, and is inefficient. And nowhere is that more evident than in housing. Housing is not merely a social good, it's also economic infrastructure, and it shapes how far people travel to work, how much they actually spend on transport and energy, how cities expand, how much carbon they emit, and whether urbanization becomes a pathway to opportunity or just a mechanism for deepening inequality. Yet housing policy in much of the southwest of Nigeria has been reduced to real estate delivery, largely disconnected from land governance, infrastructure planning, or even regional coordination and long-term sustainability. But this was not always the case. The western region of Nigeria, especially in the late 1950s, undertook one of the most ambitious and coherent housing experiments on the continent, the BODIJA housing estate in Ibadan. BODIJA was not simply a housing project. It was part of a development strategy. It was delivered by the Western Region Housing Corporation, an institution specifically mandated to assemble land, to plan neighborhoods, to provide infrastructure, and deliver housing at scale and at different levels of affordability. This institutional clarity was important. The actual vision was important. So housing delivery was not fragmented across agencies or left to speculative forces. It was embedded in a broader program that included free education, civil service expansion, and regional economic planning. So demand was not unplanned. It was anticipated. It was planned for and deliberately shaped. It was not reacted to after the fact. So especially, BODIJA was conceived as a complete neighborhood, not just a collection of houses. It followed a clear street hierarchy. It enforced setbacks and plot ratios, maintained low-rise density, and it incorporated green buffers and open spaces. The estate prioritized walkability, it prioritized ventilation and privacy, and integration rather than isolation. So crucially, BODIJA was well located. It was not pushed to the urban fringe in search of cheap land, but it was placed close to employment, close to services and institutions. So this reduced commuting distances and anchored the estate firmly within Ibadan's economic and social life. The city grew around BODIJA. It did not abandon it. So perhaps BODIJA's most radical achievement was its deliberate social mix, and I think this is particularly important. The estate included modest bungalows for lower income households, semi-detached units for middle income earners, and larger homes for senior professionals. And these were not segregated into enclaves. Teachers lived near civil servants, skilled workers shared the streets with professionals, and social integration was designed. It was not accidental. Equally important was the infrastructure-first approach. Roads, drainage, water, supply, electricity, schools, and community facilities were delivered before occupation. So infrastructure was treated as a public good, not a private burden. And this, of course, quietly subsidized affordability. When households do not need to self-provide water, access roads, and flood protection, the true cost of living falls. And this is a lesson that we may have likely forgotten, that infrastructure is the hidden foundation of affordable housing. It is the subsidy that makes inclusion possible. And we'll come to that point in a moment. Who bears that subsidy? Who takes on that subsidy? But let's consider a counterfactual scenario. What if BODIJA had not been a one-off? What if from 1960 onward, Southwest governments had delivered one BODIJA-scale mixed-income infrastructure-led district every decade in each major city? Certainly by 2020 or by now, the region will contain a network of planned inclusive neighborhoods. Informality would still exist, but it will be manageable. Commuting distances will be shorter for everyone, transport costs will be lower. Municipal finances, of course, will be much stronger. So the failure was not in design, it was in non-replication. The failure of the BODIJA effort for Southwest Nigeria was in the non-replication, the fact that we did not replicate it. BODIJA also offers lessons for climate resilience as far back as that time. Compact, low-rise density, building orientation, tree covers, cross-ventilation, and proximity to jobs, which reduced energy demand. Flood risk and all of that, of course, was also reduced. And there was no green branding. At the time, nobody was even talking of climate change or any of the issues around it. So its sustainability was not institutional. It was not, it was institutional, beg your pardon. It was not technological in any way. Today, more than 60 years later, BODIJA's urban layout and land values remain resilient and desirable. But at the same time, its infrastructure systems have deteriorated significantly due to densification, commercialization, and decades of underinvestment. And that's a fate that's common to many government-owned estates. But this does not negate BODIJA's success. Rather, it underscores the need for continuous reinvestment, especially around government estates. The durability of BODIJA's planning framework is evidence of the strength of its original conception. If you contrast this with the dominant housing models in Southwest Nigeria today, and we must admit, to preface that this is also a period of a different political economy. But from the late 1980s onward, fiscal stress, structural adjustment, rapid urbanization pushed governments out of direct housing delivery. Private developers and ad hoc public-private partnerships fill that gap. Land is now acquired piecemeal from families or speculators. Development is incremental and project-based. So, and estates, as many of us know, are gated, they are homogeneous. In other words, housing only a particular income group and targeted at narrow income brackets. And these, of course, are commercial decisions that developers make. Location decisions are driven by short-term land costs, not regional urban logic. Most new estates are located on the urban fringe, far from employment centers, and they're usually poorly served by public transport. The result is, of course, longer commute times, higher transport costs, lost productivity, rising carbon emissions, and all that. Urban sprawl has become the default growth pattern. Generally, infrastructure is rarely delivered upfront, and I'm not talking about the best estates we know. Instead, households self-provide, water, sewage, boreholes, and all that, and access through privately maintained roads. Drainage and waste management are often afterthoughts. So infrastructure has effectively been privatized at the household level. And that, of course, increases housing costs and accelerates physical deterioration. Socially, many of the best built and run estates, the best built estates, and the ones that are best run, exclude by design, pricing, and by location. And they form and systematically push low and middle income households out of the formal housing markets. And the point has to be made that, again, this is a commercial decision. So if you look at the best estates, they clearly have no plan for social housing. They have no plan for low-income housing because that simply isn't necessarily commercially viable. So, generally speaking, infrastructure in those places substitutes for social cohesion. We have become efficient at delivering projects, but inefficient at building cohesive, inclusive communities and building cities. But modern private estates get many things right too. There are very many things that they get right. And it's important to recognize that many private estates have at least rediscovered one key BODIJA principle: infrastructure first. Estates such as the Victoria Garden City, Nikon Town, Royal Gardens, Northern Foreshore Estate and Co., Friends Colony Estate, were built around this logic. And even after 20 years, some 30 years, many still retain functional roads, drainage, water supply, and relatively reliable power. Maintenance of this infrastructure, and it's very important to note that maintenance of the infrastructure in the private estates is usually financed through service charges paid by residents. In practice, these charges take the place of government rates and taxes, which are designed to function similar services, but are often inefficiently administered. So the private developers obviously have taken the place of the local government in that respect, and they use the service charges, which of course are a replacement generally of the rates that government ought to use because governments, of course, are inefficient in the collection and administration of those duty of those rates. However, these private estates are expensive precisely because they internalize infrastructure costs. These costs are capitalized into house prices, and of course, they leave little or no room for low-income households. Inclusion becomes structurally impossible. In other words, when we talk of inclusive housing, you cannot have inclusive housing where infrastructure costs have already raised property prices, and the commercial motive, obviously, is to be expected. So inclusive housing is definitely forced out of the way. The government developed Festac Town, for example, despite infrastructure failure, remains again one of the good examples of inclusive design. But again, infrastructure failure on account of poor maintenance, which is the affliction of government-built estates, has reduced the value and quality of that estate. But on the other hand, government estates in Lagos, for example, such as Abidjan or Lekki Phase 2, where infrastructure provision was partial or delayed, and the locations were distant from employment centers, have often become sites of pure speculation. Most allottees held their land without building, waiting for appreciation. And this highlights the importance of enforcing the use it or lose it principles. Land should not be a parking lot for speculation. It must serve housing needs. But the point to be made about the difference between BODIJA and contemporary estates is not just architectural, it is institutional and ideological. BODIJA followed a clear sequence: planning first, infrastructure next, housing last. It benefited from public land assembly. In other words, there was a corporation that put land together for the purpose. It benefited from unified planning authority and socialized infrastructure costs. In other words, the infrastructure costs were taken, that subsidy was borne by government. Today, land ownership is fragmented, transaction costs are high, coordination is weak, and infrastructure costs are individualized. BODIJA institutionalized inclusion through design and allocation. Modern estates institutionalize exclusion through pricing, location, and gating. BODIJA was built with a 30 to 50-year time horizon. Many modern estates are optimized for quick sales cycles, not long-term urban performance. So housing shifted from being a public development tool to a private asset class. And when housing is perceived from that perspective alone, and government does not intervene to change that approach, then you have the sort of situation where inclusive housing simply doesn't exist. Land and infrastructure are two binding constraints in unlocking inclusive housing, and that's very clear. Land and infrastructure. We must take control of land and infrastructure if we're going to have inclusive housing. Land scarcity in the southwest cities, for example, is not physical, it's institutional. There is land, but the constraints are fragmented customary ownership, slow and very costly titling, then speculative land banking, and the weak metropolitan coordination. The Land Use Act was intended to democratize access to land, but in practice, it has actually over-centralized the discretion in the grant of land. So that has increased transaction costs. It has discouraged large-scale inclusive development. Infrastructure is the second constraint that we have in inclusive housing. Housing affordability is not just about construction costs. It's about the cost of living as well. When households have to self-finance water, sanitation, access to different services and all that, affordability collapses. In BODIJA, the infrastructure was shared public capital. Today is often a private burden, one way or the other. So perhaps the way forward is properly planned public-private partnerships. Properly planned public-private partnerships. Government control land. Governments all over the southwest of Nigeria and elsewhere control land. And they can deliver bulk infrastructure at scale. Private developers bring execution capacity, they bring capital, they bring market discipline. When states provide land at subsidized rates, coordinate infrastructure delivery, and fast-track approvals, and enforce inclusionary conditions, mixed income housing becomes viable. Inclusive housing works when infrastructure comes first. Development is then coordinated. So Southwest Nigeria already functions as a mega region. Housing, labor, and transport markets are integrated. Yet planning remains fragmented. And you cannot have a Southwest initiative when planning is fragmented. Inclusive housing as a regional agenda would involve coordinated land release, aligned infrastructure corridors, and shared standards. But there's a lot to unpack here that we cannot do in the time that we've been allotted. So what must be done? First, states in the region must return to proactive land banking and pooled land assembly in order to guide urban growth strategically rather than reactively. In other words, we must acquire and assemble land in advance. And this is done by the public authorities, this is done by government. Public authorities can reduce speculation, we can lower development costs and ensure that future growth aligns with long-term planning objectives. Secondly, infrastructure provision must lead rather than follow. And that is the case because urban expansion with transport, utilities, and social services put in place early to shape sustainable and well-connected communities is really the way to go. Within this framework, inclusionary zoning should be mandatory in large housing estates. And by that I mean that if you don't have from get-go zoning permit that says there must be categories of housing in this estate, you must have high income, of course, middle income, and then you must have social housing. And they must be well provided for, well resourced, and all of that. Inclusionary zoning can only be done by government, and it must be made mandatory, especially in large housing estates. And that's the only way to ensure a consistent supply of affordable housing and promote social mix. But you know, such requirements are only fair and workable when delivered through structured public-private collaboration in which risks, costs, and benefits are shared, and developers are supported by clear rules. They are supported by upfront infrastructure and coordinated public investment. Thirdly, housing corporations should act as land assemblers and master planners, not just builders. And fourthly, housing finance must match what people actually earn, not rising property prices. And this can be done through blended approaches. And there are far too many examples practically all over the world, especially in developing countries all over the world. That mix, and this is usually a mix of government support, low interest loans, subsidized mortgages, and private investments that lower costs and risks. We have, of course, many employer-backed schemes, housing cooperatives, and also help to keep prices tied to real incomes. And it's especially important to include informal workers who do not have regular salaries, using flexible repayment schedules, alternative income verification, such as mobile money or cooperative institutions, and group lending systems. And this is combined with phased housing development and targeted subsidies. These strategies obviously make homes affordable and accessible to both formal and informal workers. And it supports a fairer and more resilient urban system. And I want to say, that I've heard it said many, many times that government cannot provide housing, that it's very difficult for government to provide housing. But the truth of the matter is that state governments who control the land can certainly provide housing if the political will to do so exists. I was just saying to the chairman of Otunba Investments, Otunba Bimbo Ashiru, that I went to Borno State 5 times while I was the vice president to commission projects, housing projects. The governor of Borno State at the time, in 3.5 years, had built close to 15,000 housing units, 15,000 housing units in Borno State. And Borno State is one of the poorest states in terms of IGR and in terms of federal allocation. And I provided almost 15,000. And I saw the buildings myself. As I said, I went almost 5 times to commission different housing projects. So it is possible with private sector support, introducing market disciplines, governments, if they wish, can provide social housing. They can provide the sort of model that BODIJA has given us. It can be provided. It's a matter of political will. Perhaps the only government that outstripped what Governor Zulu did in Borno State is probably GCON, when GCON's housing estates, which of course were in excess of 15,000 here in Lagos. So it's entirely possible. It's a matter of political will. It's a matter of, is this priority for us, or should it not be priority? In Nigeria, as you know, the management of land has not been constrained by fragmented records, overlapping claims, and bureaucratic delays. To unlock efficient urban development, land must be fully digitized, creating a transparent and accessible database of ownership, boundaries, and usage rights. Digital tightening will reduce disputes to prevent double allocation and provide a reliable foundation for investments, also for lending and planning. At the same time, the processes for land acquisition must be streamlined. And this is almost a state-by-state thing. But we can develop regional legal frameworks to simplify documentation and predictable timelines. So this will encourage both the private sector and public infrastructure development. By modernizing land administration, we can reduce corruption. We can enhance tenure security for homeowners and developers, and we can support proactive land banking and urban expansion strategies that are well coordinated with infrastructure delivery. So let me conclude by reminding us that BODIJA actually tells us that inclusive, sustainable housing is not utopia. It is possible. It is a policy choice. It's a matter of political will. Southwest Nigeria does not lack land or capital or expertise. What it lacks is a coherent regional vision that treats housing as the backbone of urban development. So the question is no longer whether we know what to do. It is whether we are prepared to do what we need to do. Thank you very much.